Ruth Elizabeth Browsard. That's her name. Ruth was after my wife's mother, and Elizabeth was after my mother, and like my mother, everyone called her Betty. Lois, my wife, had always wanted a little girl, and now we had one. Before she was born, we did everything new parents do to prepare. We decorated one of the bedrooms as a nursery, went to all kinds of courses, and stocked up on children's clothes for several years to come. After the birth, something happened to Lois. Although she remained a loving mother, she was not as attached to Betty as everyone expected. I had to take on most of her care and spend time with her. When Betty was 5 years old, she was crossing the road with a neighbor and her daughter when they were hit by a car. They were taken to St. Patrick's Hospital, where Betty was treated first as her injuries were more serious. But more than an hour passed before our neighbor was able to provide my wife's phone number so we could be notified. Lois arrived just a few minutes before me and was already pacing the waiting room until someone informed us of Betty's condition. A little later, a member of the surgical team that had operated on Betty came out to see us. She had a fractured left leg and one of her lungs was damaged, but their main concern was the head injuries. She had a concussion and was in a coma. We were told to wait for further updates. Although it wasn't required, we decided it would be worth giving blood while we waited, and so they did. Betty remained in surgery for a couple of hours after we returned. When we were finally allowed to see her, her head was wrapped in bandages and her face was covered in bruises. She also had tubes coming out of her small body and head. It broke our hearts. Lois and I spent the entire night waiting. Almost all of our family and friends visited the hospital that night, although only Lois and I could actually see it. Early in the morning, Lois was sitting on a chair by Betty's bed, her head laying on the bed, and Betty's small hand in hers. I stood and looked at them both, and my heart smiled. Later that morning, Lois and I were sitting in the hospital room just looking at our daughter when a member of the administrative staff walked into the room. I assumed she was from the administration since she was wearing regular clothes and not a medical uniform. She said she needed more information about Betty. Her first, and as it turned out, only the question shocked us. When did you adopt her? What do you mean? How old was she when you adopted her? We didn't adopt her. She's ours. There must be some kind of mistake. I'll get back to you in a moment. And she left. We just looked at each other. We didn't see her until the evening when she returned with someone else. The new woman introduced herself as the head of the hospital administration. Could you step out into the hallway for a minute, please? We left. You said you were Betty's biological parents? Yes, we said, and it is true. She was born in this hospital, and we were both there. Yes, we know. We also saw that you gave blood yesterday. While processing it, the technician who was already preparing the blood for Betty for surgery noticed your blood types. Her blood type is B. You, Mrs. Harrell, have O, and you, Mr. Harrell, have A. So what? So, there's no way she can be your daughter. What do you mean she can't be my daughter? Not just yours, Mr. Harrell. She can't be your daughter either, Mrs. Harrell. Lois and I were married for almost 6 years. Betty was born 3 days before the 9th month after our wedding. We have known each other all our lives. We were both born in this very hospital. She is 3 weeks older than me. We literally lived next door to each other, and our parents have been best friends since we were born and still live in the same house. We didn't date in high school. She had her own life, and I had mine. After high school, I went to West Point and Lois went to the University of Texas. I spent 5 years after graduation at the Pentagon while Lois came home and got married. Her husband attended law school and eventually became a lawyer. I heard from my parents that he came from a very rich family and was spoiled. I never met him or went to their wedding. Not because I wasn't invited, but because at that time I was in Walter Reed Hospital having my appendix removed. During my visits home, I occasionally ran into Lois, but never met her husband. We didn't move in the same circles. I enjoyed my time at the Pentagon. 5 years in one place is rare in the military, but the people I worked with were able to arrange it for me. I didn't smoke or drink, so I didn't have much of a social life. Much like in academia. After about a year in Washington, I became a tour guide at the National Air and Space Museum. That's when my social life became active. Tourists, secretaries, legislative aides, prostitutes, housewives, and lobbyists, every woman in Washington County seemed to find her way to the museum, and many of them ended up in my bed. Over the next 4 years, I enjoyed more sex than any person has any right to. My favorite mistress was the ex-wife of a U.S. senator. She was red-haired and loved sex, and I mean I truly adored it. The only time I had two women at the same time was with her and a Navy officer. The officer was a lieutenant commander, and I met her at the Pentagon in the center of the courtyard. She was eating a hot dog and reading some documents. I sat on the bench opposite her and just watched her eat. After a couple of minutes, she noticed that I was looking at her, and she started eating for my pleasure, and I really liked it. I walked over and sat down next to her. The hot dogs are good here. Yes, they are. I prefer meat ones. Me too, especially Nathan. His hot dogs seem bigger and juicier. But they're so big that sometimes they come out of the bun. Yeah, I hate it. I like it better when they fill the bun completely. And this went on for another 15 minutes. In the end, it ended with a date the next evening. We had sex all night. 2 days later, it was Saturday, and I was minding my own business at the museum when she showed up. We were talking, and then red-haired came up. That night was the first time I watched two women make out with each other. It was the hottest thing I've ever seen. This is how my military career went. 5 years of service and 4 years of the hottest, most varied sex imaginable. I considered staying in the Army, but my father had a stroke, and I came home to help. By then, he had 4 fast food restaurants that he could no longer manage, so I took them over. I had no idea how to run a business. I simply held daily meetings with management and reviewed weekly profit and loss reports. Everything went as usual. I realized that I didn't need to know how to make or sell hamburgers or fry chicken. I just needed to surround myself with people who can do it. Lois and her husband divorced after 4 years. Shortly after returning home, I mowed my parents' lawn, and Lois drove up. Her parents told her that I was back. We hugged, chatted, and decided to have dinner together that evening. The next week, we had sex for the first time, and I regretted not trying to sleep with her back in high school. She was, as they say, hotter than a $2 gun. We met often and had sex often. We never talked about being only with each other, but I increasingly wanted to spend time only with her and thought that she felt the same. I've never seen her with anyone else or heard of her dating anyone. Until one evening. I was at one of my father's restaurants, watching how things worked on a Saturday night when it was busy. I was in the office looking through the one-way mirror when I saw her walk in with some guy. I watched as they ordered food, brought it to the table, and ate. I saw how they laughed together, how she stroked his hand, and he brushed the hair out of her eyes. I then saw them kiss a few times before leaving. I saw them get into the red Mustang and heard the roar of the engine as they drove away. I've never been a real car guy. Cars have always been just a means of transportation and a convenience for me. My car was a 6-year-old F-150 pickup, and I was fine with that. But I admit that I like the roar that Mustangs make. I won't say my heart was broken, but I definitely felt something. Disgust, envy, jealousy, I had no idea. But I didn't like it, whatever it was. After they left, I went home. I was living in my old room at my parents' house while I looked for something more permanent. Lois had her own house, which she got in her divorce. It was a very nice house. She seemed to be doing well after the divorce. Lois's house was a long way from mine, but I drove past it anyway. The Mustang sat in her driveway. The next morning, I was driving my mother to morning service at her church. We were driving home after church, and I decided to drive past Lois' house again. The Mustang was still there. Later that day, I was sitting on the porch with my dad when Lois pulled up to her parents' house. She saw us and came up. She leaned over, kissed my father on the cheek, and then was about to kiss me, but I raised the glass of iced tea to my lips, blocking her kiss. She tilted her head and looked at me. She talked to her father for a while before turning to me. Will you come back later? No, I don't think so. I have a German chocolate cake. This is my favorite cake. Great. I hope you and the guy who spent the night at your place enjoy it. She looked at me and was about to say something, but, looking at my father, she changed her mind, turned and left. She went to her parents and looked in our direction before going inside. I adjusted the blanket over my father's legs, but I could still see Lois looking in our direction. Later in the evening, I received a call. It was Lois. Hello. You don't own me. This is true. So what I do is none of your business. True again. And who I sleep with is none of your business either. You're on a roll. Keep going. She hung up. I haven't heard from her in over a week. I was in a furniture store trying to figure out what I might need for my new house or apartment when I finally found something that fits. Dad got better, but he still needed constant help, so Mom hired full-time nurses for him. She also started insisting that I find my own place, but didn't forget about restaurants. Isn't this too modern for you? Lois asked, pointing to the living room I was looking at. Perhaps, but I could get used to it. Listen, Brian, I'm not going to apologize for sleeping with someone else. Did I ask you for this? No, I didn't ask. There was a long pause as we both studied the rug in front of the sofa I was looking at. I don't want to fight. I want us to be friends, more than friends. I looked at her. Friends? Fine, but nothing more as long as you feel the need to sleep with other men. The only person I want to have sex with is you. She may have thought so at the time, but it didn't last long. I didn't buy any furniture then, but we bought it 2 months later when I moved into her house. And we bought it before our honeymoon in 10 months. My father still owned restaurants, but by then there were 5 of them, and I was his general manager. I made good money, and we lived comfortably. We were still living at Lois's house. I tried several times to persuade her to buy a larger one, but she insisted on waiting. I never asked her how she managed to get a house in her divorce. In fact, we rarely mentioned her divorce or her ex-husband. This brings us to the time we were told that Betty could not be our daughter. Lois and I just stared at her, mostly because we had no words. For about 10 seconds, the entire corridor fell into dead silence, as if everyone in the area was waiting for our reaction. Then I exploded, continuously shouting insults, questions, and curses. I made such a fuss that security was called, and they tried to escort us to the administrative offices, but I didn't budge. Finally, I calmed down and, with great reluctance, went with them. Lois stayed with Betty. I was taken to the director's office and asked to sit down. I refused. Our situation seemed to attract the attention of many people. I walked around this office while literally a dozen people ran back and forth, trying to avoid me at all costs. Every 30 seconds I tried to talk to the director, who kept asking me to be patient. After what seemed like an eternity, 3 people came in, took one look at me, and began discussing something in a whisper with the director, who then asked them to sit down. 2 security officers stood right outside the office door. Mr. Harrell, please sit down. Please. I sat down. 5 years ago, on your daughter's birthday. On Betty's birthday, 2 more children were born at the same time. 1 boy and another girl. At that time, we had a nurse in the maternity ward who was involved in a conflict with the hospital and was fired for a reason. What we have found out so far is that when she learned of her impending dismissal, she decided to take revenge. Let me explain that our procedures for dealing with newborns are as impeccable as they can be. You remember when Betty was born, we put the bracelet on her wrist and ankle. Then we put the matching numbered bracelets on both of you. You also have to remember that everyone in the room confirmed the matching numbers on all 4 bracelets. This was done right after the birth and before anyone, or he could leave the room. Do you remember that? Yeah, but it now appears that our disgruntled employee, in a final act of revenge against the hospital, may have switched the 2 girls' bracelets. To confirm this, we will conduct DNA tests on both children and both sets of parents. Our legal department is already handling the legal aspects. We are shocked that something like this could happen and cannot even imagine how you and Mrs. Harrell or the other couple are feeling at this moment. At this time, we can only apologize. Oh God, I can't believe this. How can you apologize so calmly when you're turning our lives upside down? Do you understand the pain this causes and will continue to cause? This is my daughter you're talking about. Well, actually, we've established that she is not your daughter. You are a heartless bastard. I understand your feelings, but these are facts and we cannot change them. Our legal department has already determined what to do next. At the same time, neither you nor your wife are allowed to remove the child from this hospital. I jumped up and the guards grabbed me. Mr. Harrell, I understand your indignation, but you don't understand anything. Betty is my daughter, and I'm taking her away from this madhouse, and I'm going to sue you, your staff, and your damn dog. Mr. Harrell, our legal department has already determined. To hell with your legal department. I'm taking my daughter out of here. I rushed out of his office and went straight to Betty's room. Lois was outside and two police officers were standing in front of the door. Obviously, taking Betty along was no longer an option. Brian, what's going on? These cops told me I had to leave the room. I took her to the waiting area and explained the situation as calmly as possible. Oh my God, Brian, can they really do this? It seems so. Lois immediately took out her phone and made a call. She pressed one button, so the number must have been on the speed dial. Hi, I'm at St. Patrick's Hospital and I need help. Okay? Meet me out front. Who was it? My ex-husband. He can help us, she said, heading towards the main entrance. Her ex-husband? On speed dial. 15 minutes later, a bright red Maserati screeched to a stop in the roundabout outside the hospital's main entrance. I saw this car in the city and wondered who it belonged to. Now I know. Lois ran to the driver's door as a tall, handsome man stepped out of the car. Usually, when a tall man gets out of a Maserati, it looks comical, but in the hug and kiss that my wife received from this driver, I did not find anything funny. They released the hug and, holding hands, approached me. Brian, this is Jerry Schofield. Jerry, this is Brian. We didn't shake hands, mainly because Lois's left hand was in his right. She began to tell him our story, and he listened attentively. About halfway through, he looked at me and saw that I was looking at their hands. He let go of her hand. It's a mess. I'll talk to one of my colleagues and see what he thinks. We can't do anything until tomorrow, and right now the hospital has us by the throat. So since you're not allowed to see her, go home and try to rest. I'll call you as soon as I find out something new. Okay, we'll try. Thanks, Jerry. And she kissed him again. Not once, but twice. On the lips. The second kiss lasted longer than the first. Now my stomach was churning. Strongly, I looked at Lois. She looked down and said, "See you at home." Since we arrived in different cars, it made sense to drive home separately. Lois arrived home first and seemed to go straight to bed. I was in no hurry to return. Thoughts of DNA tests, my little daughter. Who wasn't my daughter, red Maseratis, kissing, speed dialing, and holding hands made me stop and think about it several times. When I finally got home, Lois was already asleep, or pretending to be. Either way, I didn't want to talk to her. The next morning, we got up and got ready to go to the hospital. I tried several times to ask about kissing, but she simply refused to answer and conversation was kept to a minimum. These were mostly short questions and even shorter answers. We left, separately. When we arrived at the hospital, we each tried to enter Betty's room, but again we were not allowed in. We were told to go to the director's office. He waited until the security officers arrived, then invited us inside. Here is a court order allowing you to visit Betty, but prohibiting her from being removed from the hospital until further orders from the court. And here is another court order requiring you to provide DNA samples. The other parents and child involved in this case have received the same orders. You have 24 hours to complete it. We have already taken a sample from Betty. Until this mess is sorted out, the other child will remain in her house. Why can she stay with them and we can't take Betty home? The main reason is that Betty now requires constant medical attention, and in that regard, you will be glad to know that she is awake and awake. She has been asking about you. We rushed to her room and were not stopped. Half an hour later, lab technicians arrived to take DNA samples from Lois and me. That afternoon, Lois received a call from her lawyer friend Jerry. According to him, if it turns out that the children were indeed switched at birth, they will have to be returned to their biological parents. That was the state law. He also offered his services as our lawyer. We agreed. For 3 days, we sat on pins and needles. There was very little dialogue between us. One of us was in Betty's room all the time, but rarely together. It would seem that the questions that arose from this situation should have brought us closer. But the way Jerry Schofield was greeted when he appeared at the hospital, sincere and open kisses, as well as holding hands, made me step aside and reflect on my life, and it didn't look good. Betty recovered well and liked the cast on her leg. She couldn't wait to show it to the other kids at preschool. On the 4th morning, Lois was informed that the DNA results were ready, and she was called into the hospital's main conference room at 10 a.m. and asked to bring her lawyer. She called our new lawyer, who assured her he would be there. Just before 10 o'clock, Lois and I kissed and hugged Betty, not knowing if we would see her again. At 10 o'clock, Lois, our new lawyer, and I headed to the conference room. The director saw us and stopped us. "Mr. Harrell, you don't have to be here this morning." "What? Why?" "Because you are not the father of any of the girls." I took a deep breath, looked at Lois, whose eyes were the size of dinner plates, and walked out of the hospital. Half an hour later, I was at my parents' house. After another half hour, they heard the whole story. My father, who was still limping after the stroke, came up to me. "We'll find a way to make her pay." Mom sat and cried. My phone rang. It was Lois. I turned it off. I've never been much of a drinker, but I took my dad's bottle of whiskey, went out onto the porch, and sat down. My father followed me. We sat there talking about restaurants, Mom's new car, my baseball team, and our favorite movie, The African Queen. We talked about everything except Lois and Betty. At 6 o'clock in the evening, my mother came out and asked if we wanted to eat. We both said no. Twice my father went into the house to go to the toilet. I didn't move. At midnight, we were still there. He went to the toilet twice more. We never touched the whiskey. Dawn found us still on the porch. My father fell asleep, but I didn't sleep a wink. I expected Lois to visit her parents, but she never showed up. I got up, went into the house, and went to the toilet. Mom was sleeping. I got into my car and drove home. There was a red Maserati in the driveway. I didn't stop. I returned to my parents' house. They were both already up and minding their own business when I returned. We talked a little more before I sat down in the living room. My daughter turned out to be not my daughter, and my other daughter was not mine either. If both girls were born on the same day, which was 9 months after our wedding, then Lois must have slept with someone else shortly before our wedding, if not right on our wedding day. I checked my phone. Apart from one call the day before, Lois didn't call again. I didn't know whether to be angry or happy. At that moment, Lois' parents entered the house through the kitchen door. Her mother was crying. She ran up to me and hugged me. "Oh, Brian, Betty told us everything. We're so sorry. Is there anything we can do to help?" "No, other mother, nothing." For years, I called her the other mom and Lois' father the other dad. We just tried to call Lois, but she's not answering. "We wanted to know how you were." "I can handle it." We talked for a few more minutes, and they left. Mom handed me a cup of coffee. "What's next?" she asked. "I will return to active duty." That's what we thought. If you haven't made up your mind yet, we'd like you to consider staying and taking over the restaurants full-time. We have a very good retirement portfolio, and we want to travel and eat in other people's places. Restaurants for a change. Will retain ownership until your divorce is finalized, if you're going to get a divorce, and then they'll be yours. I don't know, Dad. Betty will be given to her biological parents, and I probably won't be allowed to see her anymore. Lois will be left with her real daughter, and I don't want anything to do with either of them. I don't think I can handle it. If I see Betty, or whatever they call her, and her parents in one of the restaurants. Just think about it, okay? Cold. I left and headed to what was once my home. The red Maserati was still there. To hell with them. I wanted to get my things, and I was going to do it. When I tried to open the front door, it was locked. My key still fit, and I entered. There were no signs of life when I passed Betty's room. The door was open, and nothing had changed. I continued to the master bedroom. That door was also open. The bed was in disarray, and there were things scattered everywhere, but no one was there. Most of my army uniforms hung in the spare bedroom. I have needed them in recent years due to my reserve obligations. I started moving them, as well as some of my other clothes and personal belongings, into the car. I took all my military documents from the file cabinet, as well as everything else that was important to me. I took Betty's photo from the shelf. I looked at it and put it back. He got into the car and drove away. I realized I hadn't eaten, so I stopped at a kebab shop. It was new and I hadn't tried it yet. I had just received my order when a local news report started playing on the TV. It was about the deliberate switching of two girls at St. Patrick's Hospital 5 years ago. Then they showed photographs of two couples. Men held women. I couldn't see the face of one of the women, but I saw the other. It was Lois, in the arms of Jerry Schofield. "Hey, isn't that Jerry?" asked one of the three men at the next table. "Yes." "It's his ex-wife, isn't it? What are they talking about?" Everyone fell silent and began to listen. Their child was switched. I didn't know they had children. They don't exist. That's why they got divorced. She wanted a child, but he didn't. He only ever loved three things: her, red cars, and freedom. All his cars were red. He crashed the red Corvette that his parents bought him when he graduated from high school. Then he had a red Mustang. Now he has a red Maserati. If he loved freedom so much, why did he need to marry? He loved her and knew she wanted a child, but he thought that if he could show her a fast, busy life, she would soon forget about having a child. But it didn't work. She still wanted a child, and he still didn't want to be tied to one, so even though they loved each other, they divorced so that each could live the life they wanted. My God, I don't know if this is love or selfishness on both sides. How do you know all this? Jesus Christ, Jonesy, Jerry, and I have been best friends since we were kids. I was his best man. So what is the TV talking about then? They told me about it last night. He's always had a drinking problem, and Lois used to have one too, but she hardly drinks anymore. They both relaxed last night. It was only the second time in as many years that she got drunk. They drove her car to the boardroom and started drinking. Joe, the bartender, called me and I got there. Lois was crying and they were both drunk, so I took them home after a few cups of coffee. And after a cold shower, they told me the whole story. He paused, took a bite of his sandwich, and sipped something before continuing. After the divorce, Lois married some old friend with the sole purpose of having a child. She and Jerry practically avoided each other, but 2 nights before the wedding, they decided to spend one last night together. They went to Beaumont, had dinner and drinks. They both got drunk, and Jerry lost consciousness. Some cowboy helped Lois drag him to the room and put him to bed. Then this cowboy began to talk to Lois, touch her, and make her feel sorry for himself, and in the end, this scoundrel persuaded her to sleep with him. Until last night, that was the last time she got drunk. Turns out he wasn't the first one to convince her to sleep with him when she was drunk. That happened several times before she married Jerry. That's why she stopped drinking. Jesus Christ, are you serious? It's true. Anyway, she did get married and gave birth to a baby girl 9 months later. For the first few months of their marriage, She and Jerry stayed away from each other, but shortly before the baby was born, they met again and their old feelings began to flare up. They started having sex again and didn't stop. A few days ago, her daughter was hit by a car and she was hospitalized. Blood tests showed that the girl could not be her daughter or her husband. That's when they discovered that the children had been switched. A DNA test was conducted on all parents and both children, and it turned out that Lois' husband was not the father of her daughter. Until this moment, she sincerely believed that this was so. Well, who is her father then? Apparently, it's that cowboy from Beaumont. Unless she lied and slept with someone else, but I don't think so. It gives me a headache. So now they're trying to figure out what to do. Apparently, the courts have ruled that both girls must be released to their biological parents no later than noon the day after tomorrow. Oh man, it's like watching a train wreck. You know it's a disaster, but you can't look away. So where is the husband now? When I saw them a couple of hours ago, they didn't know. But since they have no idea what to do next, they're taking their time to look for him. At that moment, his phone rang. Hey, Jerry. Silence. Seriously. What are you going to do now? More silence as he listened. Okay, good luck. Keep me posted and let me know if I can help. What is he talking about? They were at her house. They went to pack Betty's things to take them to the hospital and saw that her husband was there and had taken his things. My food remained untouched. Just when I thought my life couldn't get any worse, it did. Not only did my wife plan to cheat on me with her ex-husband 2 days before our wedding, but she let some slimy cowboy talk her into sleeping with him. Moreover, she had sex with her ex-husband for most of our marriage, and I had no idea. Everything I had ever read or heard said that cheaters always give themselves away. If she gave any signs, I missed them. I paid, then got into the car. I sat there for about 15 minutes, thinking, and made a decision. When I got back to my parents' house, I announced, I'm taking the restaurants. I'm the one who hasn't done anything wrong. Damn it, I'm not going to let them run me out of town. I'm going to look for a place to live, and I'll be back in time for dinner. There was a gated community just a few minutes from their home. I went there, looked at 3 different apartment plans, chose one, filled out an application, left a deposit, and left. I was heading to one of the restaurants when my phone rang. Yes, Lois. Brian, I. What do you want, Lois? Are you coming to say goodbye to Betty? No. Why? It's none of your damn business. I didn't tell her that I couldn't bear the thought of saying goodbye. But I'll stop by the house tomorrow morning to pick up the rest of my things. I don't think you should be there. If you want to, we'll have to talk someday. This is exactly what I want, and we have nothing to talk about. I will take my things to make room for the father of your child. Brian. Oh, I forgot. You don't know who he is. You were too drunk to realize who was having sex with you. Of course, you can hit the bars until you find him again. After all, there are so many cowboys and bars in Beaumont. It shouldn't take you more than a couple of years to sleep with all of them. Oh God, how did you? I interrupted the call, but my phone rang again almost immediately. I turned it off. I had dinner with my parents and slept through the night. I left home early the next morning. There was an envelope under my windshield. I threw him to the ground and got into the car. I saw Lois running towards me from the house next door. Brian, please. I opened the window. You don't have anything to say that I want to hear. You only married me to have a baby, and it turns out you didn't even need me for that. Our divorce shouldn't be a problem. After all, you're sleeping with your lawyer, and that should get you some kind of discount. I'm going home to get my things. Stay away until I'm done. I started to drive away in reverse. Brian, please. The divorce papers arrived here. I'll pick them up. It took me 2 hours to finish packing my things. The tools in the garage took the most time. I went to my new apartment. My application was approved, and I was given a key and access code to the gate. I was in no hurry to unload my car. At 6 in the evening, I was with my parents. Lois' car was parked outside her parents' house. Apparently, she was watching me because my car had not yet come to a complete stop when she was already standing next to me. Brian, sooner or later, we'll have to talk. What should we talk about, Lois? I got out of the car and headed towards the house. You slept with a complete stranger 2 days before our wedding and gave birth to his child, and you're in love with your ex-husband. This is the messiest situation I can imagine. What can you say to fix this? Well, it's not that easy to say. Go away, Lois. She grabbed my hand and I pulled it away. I need to tell you. What? What do you have to tell me? That I'm very. Don't you dare say you're sorry. You're a cheater and a liar, and you have a daughter who will grow up not knowing who her father is. All the apologies in the world can't fix that. I entered the house. She didn't follow me. Neither of my parents said anything. I felt like a huge weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I spoke out, and it was over. I was overcome with a feeling of peace and tranquility. Let everything be as it will be, because now everything will be fine. A few days later, I had a meeting with restaurant managers. Then I went to a furniture store because I still hadn't finished buying furniture for my new apartment. Isn't this too modern for you? I guess, but I can get used to it. We stood and looked at each other. Betty asked me to hug and kiss you before she was taken away. She was crying and wanted to see her daddy. I turned away and nodded. She touched my back, and I quickly backed away. I took a deep breath. Where is your daughter? I don't know. I turned to her. I asked the foster care service to find a family for her. I could never be a good mother. I've never seen her. I remembered the man in the restaurant saying that both Lois and Jerry were selfish. He was right. I walked around the coffee table and sat down on the sofa. She sat down next to me. The social worker said she would most likely be adopted by the family that raised her. That's their priority. Silence. How did you find out about Beaumont? I thought before answering. I'll never tell you this. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of this information. Let her think about this for the rest of her life. A little more silence. Finally, I said, you cheated on me. Yes, changed. I didn't deserve this. No, I didn't deserve it. I don't know how to deal with this. Another long silence, and I stood up. She touched my hand, and I looked at her. Is there anything I can do to help you? Yes. Find a way to make this pain go away. She dropped her hand to her lap and looked at the floor. I don't know how to do this. Me too. And I went out. The divorce proceeded without meetings, clashes, or litigation. The house was left to her, and she kept it. It did not require our savings or investments. Probably, compared to Jerry's money, ours were small change. I didn't argue or feel guilty about keeping it all. A month after the divorce was finalized, I became the sole owner of the restaurants. I even took the time to finish purchasing furniture for my new home. I saw a red Maserati in town sometimes, but didn't pay attention to who was in it. My parents went away for most of the time. They fell in love with cruising and practically lived on ships. I checked their house periodically and was still happy to see Lois' parents. When Lois and I were casually dating, we never admitted it. And thank God I didn't see Betty and her family. 15 months have passed since the divorce. My personal life sucked. It was like my first year at the Pentagon. Rare dates and rare sex, that's all. I spent a lot of time improving restaurants. I was still driving the same old pickup truck that was starting to show its age. Like I said, I'm not a big car guy, but I've always enjoyed doing simple things like changing the oil and rotating the tires. I've never enjoyed spending hours washing and waxing my cars. If it weren't for car washes and rain, they would never be clean. I just changed the oil at my parents' place because it was easier to do there than at mine. I was driving home and saw a car on the side of the road with a flat tire. To me, most modern cars look the same. This car looked like a million others. It was a silver four-door sedan. The license plate was a little unusual. It wasn't a personal number, but it caught my attention. HMH followed by 4 digits. I immediately thought of Hook 'em Horns from the University of Texas. The driver wasn't pretty in the traditional sense, but she looked very attractive in what you might call a girl next door way, and she cried, "Do you need help? Do you have a spare?" She sat and sobbed, but was able to answer, "Probably." I opened the door and pressed the button to open the trunk. "I can change it quickly." After 15 minutes, the car was ready. By then, she had stopped crying, thanked me, and offered me $20. I felt like she was having a bad day, and the flat tire was the last straw, so she just broke down. I thanked her for the offer, but refused the money. Then I got into the car and drove away. A week later, I was in one of my restaurants, and my car wouldn't start. I was cleaning corrosion from one of the battery terminals and had almost decided it was time to buy a new car when the assistant manager interrupted me. "Sorry, boss, this is for you," she said, handing me a tray with a bag and a large glass of soda. The package included a deluxe burger and a large portion of fries. "What is this?" She laughed. "This lady who just left ordered this and told me to bring it out to you." I got to see Hook 'em Horns come out onto the street. I laughed and told her what happened. She went back inside, and I started the car. The following Saturday, I mowed my parents' lawn. My car was parked with the hood open because I was checking the oil. I felt, rather than heard, someone approach. I looked and saw the driver of the Avalon standing there. I turned off the lawnmower. "Well, hello. How's your car?" "Okay, thanks to you. They couldn't fix the tire, so I had to buy a new one. I think I drove it after it got a flat. Look, I was at a friend's house nearby and saw your car. If you still need work to do, mine and a couple of other yards in my area could use some maintenance." I just looked at her. Then it dawned on me. She thinks I need a job and is trying to help me. The last time she saw my car, the hood was up, suggesting it was broken. I explained to her what I was doing when I heard the unmistakable sound of a powerful engine approaching down the street. I looked and saw a red Ferrari turning into Lois' parents' driveway. I watched as Lois and Jerry walked out and went inside. Apparently, he replaced Maserati, changed it. I hated that word. I realized that other than hating the word, I felt nothing when I saw them. Then I looked at my guest. "Thanks, but this is my parents' house. They moved away, and I'm just doing them a favor." "Oh, I'm sorry. I saw your car with the hood up and you mowing the grass, and I thought, now I'm so ashamed." I laughed. "Nothing to be ashamed of. By the way, thanks for lunch last week." "Oh God, now I'm even more embarrassed." I laughed, and then she laughed too. We stood and talked for a while. Finally, I said, "You said your lawn needs maintenance. I'd be happy to do it." She looked at me and smiled. "That would be great. Thank you." I put the lawnmower away and followed it home. A nice house with a large yard that hasn't been mowed for a long time. The garage had room for 3 cars. In addition to her Avalon, there was a Lexus there. In third place was a great zero-turn lawn mower and other gardening tools and equipment that most men own. I assumed my husband had been too busy to cut the grass lately. I've never used a zero-turn mower, so it took a little time to figure out how it worked, but I got the hang of it, and within 2 hours the lawn was mowed and trimmed. When I finished, she offered to pay me, but I refused, saying that I would rather take something cold. We sat on the porch, drank a glass of iced tea, and chatted. Her name was Christina, Chris for short. Her husband died 8 months ago. He suffered a heart attack while jogging and died before he could be taken to hospital. He was the manager of one of the oil refineries in the city. She worked in a high-end jewelry store, so they lived well. Without noticing how time had flown by, I suddenly realized that the sun had begun to set. I asked her if she wanted to have dinner with me. She hesitated and refused. I was disappointed, but I accepted it. Life went on. Another month has passed. My parents came back, paid the bills, did the laundry, and went on another cruise. I went to their house to check things out, and was about to leave when the Avalon pulled into the driveway again and Chris got out of the car. Well, hello. Hi, I've come here a couple of times, hoping you'd be here. Is your offer for dinner still valid? Certainly. Great. How about tonight? And that's how it all began. We dated for 6 weeks before we had sex. It was a long time ago for both of us, but we tried to catch up. Slowly, quickly, gently, hard, in bed, in the shower, in the garage, in cars. We even tried it in my car, but it didn't work. The only place we didn't do this was at her house. In fact, I've never been inside her house. I was in the garage, but I never went inside. I thought that she still feels the presence of her husband in the house and is trying to preserve it, not allowing me to invade this personal space. I was fine with that. For now. After 4 months, I realized that I had fallen in love and was going to tell her about it, but she stopped me. I think I know what you want to say, but before you do it, I need to tell you something. I've never lied to you, but I haven't told you everything either. She paused, took a deep breath, and spoke. When you first asked me to dinner, I was hesitant because I have kids. 2 kids. After Jack died, I heard that it's hard for women with kids to have a serious relationship with a man because he won't want to have a ready-made family. After you invited me and I refused, I thought and realized that I wanted to go out again and communicate. You were supposed to just be a date or two, so I decided that it was not important to talk about children. But as I got to know you and my feelings for you became stronger, I began to feel guilty for not telling you. Then there was a fear that I would lose you if I told you, and a fear that I'll lose you if I don't tell you. Long pause. I'm sorry. I looked at her and she started crying. Forgive me. I was just being selfish. I remembered another woman who was selfish. Damn it. Why can't people be honest? Why should we play games and mock relationships and feelings? I thought about Lois, about her betrayal and lies, and my anger began to grow. I was sure I loved this woman and thought she loved me, but she left me out of the most important aspect of her life. Crap, crap, crap. So you decided to keep them a secret. You didn't have enough trust in me to tell me about such a huge part of your life. And you didn't have enough faith in our relationship to believe that it might not matter. I started towards the door, but stopped and, very calmly and quietly, said, I didn't do anything to make you believe that it would matter. I didn't do anything to make you think that I wouldn't want to share every aspect of your life. I did nothing to justify your decision to not include me in the most important aspect of your life, and I did nothing to deserve your humiliation. I went home. The next 3 weeks were the worst of my life. Somehow they turned out worse than when I found out about Lois's betrayal and her child. I missed Chris. Up to this point, my restaurants have specialized in hamburgers and chicken, but I was thinking about adding a couple of pizza places. I heard about one that was for sale and walked around with its current owner. She was in the food court of the mall, and we were just about to go behind the counter and into his office when I heard a screech and felt something grab my legs. I looked down and saw the most beautiful face I had ever seen. She looked at me and smiled. Hi, Dad. Shocked, I picked it up. She is grown up. Hello, Princess. Betty hugged me so tightly that I could hardly breathe. Mom, this is my first dad. Through my tears, I saw Chris standing there looking at us. Hello, she said. Hello. I take it you two know each other. Yes, acquaintances. It's been a long time. She's grown up. I don't know how she remembered me. It's hard to forget you. We just looked at each other while Betty talked non-stop. I didn't hear a word she said because I was focused on Chris. Finally, I heard Betty say something about her sister. Sorry, Princess, what did you say? I said, that's my sister, and she pointed to the little girl standing next to Chris. I looked and saw a miniature version of Lois. Same hair, same smile, same eyes. Her name is Jackie. Hi, Jackie. How are you? Okay, thank you. I looked at Chris again. I don't know what to say. Never in my wildest dreams did I imagine that I would meet you here, with With Betty, we saw no reason to change her name. Betty was still hugging me tightly. "Come on, girls, let's leave Mr. Harrell alone. He probably has a lot to do, and we still have a lot of shopping to do." Betty didn't want to leave, and I didn't want to let her go either. "Chris, maybe you and the girls would like to get some pizza." "Mom, please, can I?" Betty begged. She tried not to smile. "Why don't we eat at home? We'll cook something." "I'd like that." "Me too." Neither Betty nor I wanted to leave, so I walked them to the car. We had leftovers. Betty and I ate meatloaf. Jackie had chicken, and Chris ate salad but barely touched it. The girls went to bed at 8:30. Chris offered me a glass of wine. I agreed. She sat down in a chair that was clearly hers. There was a chair nearby that, apparently, was his. I preferred to sit on the sofa. No one spoke for several minutes. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you about the girls." "Why didn't you do that? I mean, besides the fact that they're the same girls who were switched at birth." "I told you that I heard that most men don't like ready-made families, but that's not the whole truth. The fact is that Betty lost her first father, who turned out to be you. Then she lost her biological father, who was my husband, Jack. I didn't want her to be in a relationship with another man again and then lose him. I wasn't going to put her through that." I took a sip of wine. I realized that of all the reasons she could give me, of all the explanations, this was the truth. I remembered how she said she was selfish. But this last moment showed me that what she did was the least selfish thing. She sacrificed her happiness for her daughter. I put the glass down, stood up, and walked over to her chair. There was fear in her eyes as they turned to the door. She was afraid that I would leave. I walked up to her chair, put my hands on the armrests, leaned over and kissed her. She returned my kiss. "I love you." She smiled. "I love you too." 3 days later, Jackie met my parents. They already knew Chris. Of course, Betty was already familiar with them and felt at home. She took Jackie around the house and showed her a box of toys. It was fun to watch them. Chris and I discussed the feasibility of bringing the girls here. Many complications arose in this situation, especially when Lois' parents, and perhaps Lois herself, saw Betty playing in the yard, which inevitably would happen sooner or later. This situation was just as difficult for my parents to understand as it was for Chris and me. No amount of logic, common sense, or explanation could explain our situation. We made up the rules as we went along. The next day, I was alone with my parents. "What are you going to do when Lois and her parents see Betty here? You can't hide her, you know." "We're not trying to hide it." I told them again that we are making up the rules as we come up with them. It didn't take long before this question became relevant. A couple of days later, Chris, the girls, and I were eating pizza at a pizza place in the mall that I was planning on buying. Lois's parents were walking by and saw me and began to approach us. They haven't seen Betty yet. When they saw her, the other mother exclaimed. Betty heard her, recognized her, and hugged her. I introduced them to Chris and Jackie. They knew Lois' story and knew that she had given her biological daughter up for adoption. Who adopted her, of course, was confidential information and was not subject to disclosure. They also knew that Betty had been returned to her biological parents. But when they met Jackie, they realized that this was their real granddaughter. The resemblance to Lois was undeniable. They saw the same features that I saw when I first saw her. The other mother took a deep breath. Chris couldn't help but notice and looked at me. I nodded. We sat and chatted for almost half an hour. The eyes of the other mom and dad rarely left Jackie's. If she noticed it, she didn't show it. The other mom's final comment as they left. "We really hope to see you and the girls again, Chris. Please." Chris nodded. "I'm sure it can be arranged." I looked at my watch, then at Chris. "I'll give her 10 minutes. Chris said, "Oh God, Brian, what are we going to do?" Chris told me that she and her husband, Jack, knew that if they stayed in this city, something like this would inevitably happen. They considered transferring Jack to another job to avoid this, but then he died and her life was left in limbo. We will live our lives and love girls. We will deal with each issue as it comes. I was wrong for about 10 minutes. 9 passed before my phone rang. Hello. This is true? Yes. She hung up. Lois. Lois. I could hear her, oh crap, but the girls didn't hear it. I took her hand. I love you, and we will get through whatever comes our way. I was at home later that evening when my phone rang. Hello. Silence. I hung up. 10 minutes later, the same thing happened. I turned off the phone. My parents returned from their cruise, and my mother called me every day to tell me that Lois' car was parked at her parents' house. Chris and I decided enough was enough. I told Mom and Dad that we would arrive at noon on Sunday, knowing that she would tell Lois' parents, who would naturally tell Lois. At exactly noon, we pulled up in my new F-150 Club cab pickup. A red Ferrari stood nearby. We were helping the girls out of the car when Lois and Jerry walked towards us. Betty ran to Lois and hugged her. Lois hugged her back, caressing her face and brushing her hair out of her eyes. Chris and Lois never dated. When this all started, they were always separated. Hello, I'm Lois. I'm Christina. Jackie, come here please. I want you to meet someone. Her name is Lois. Hello, Jackie said and extended her hand. Hello, Jackie. How are you? Lois slowly reached out and took her hand. She held the handshake for as long as she could manage. Would you like to join us for lunch? Asked Chris. Lois and Jerry looked at each other. This was the last thing they expected. Sure, I guess. The first 15 minutes of lunch were tense. The next 2 hours went much better. Lois' parents joined us for the last half hour. Lois was initially a little shy interacting with the girls, but considering the circumstances, I think it went pretty well. Finally, Lois announced that it was time for her and Jerry to leave. The 4 of us went out into the yard. Lois stopped and looked at Chris. She reached out and took her hand. I wanted to make the right decision for Jackie, and you confirmed that I did the right thing. I always thought I wanted to be a mother, but I was wrong. Brian raised Betty, not me. She fell silent, and we all looked at each other. I'm not meant to be a mother, but I could be a very good aunt, if you let me. And then the tears flowed. Chris was in my arms and still crying as the powerful red Ferrari sped up the street, and I heard Jerry trying to change gears, drive the car, and comfort a sobbing Lois all at the same time. Lois kept her word. She was a great aunt. I never missed a birthday, a concert, a football match, or an illness. Even for twins who were born next year. Uncle Jerry took turns riding with the kids in his red Lamborghini. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one. Click to the next one. Click to the next one.